Well, it doesn't matter that the pronouncements of Greta Thunberg are historically illiterate. When the Swedish teen speaks, we are meant to listen, as if her words are holy writ. This week, she told Sky News that the climate crisis, quote, started in the UK. Since that's where the Industrial Revolution started, we started to burn coal there. So, of course, the UK has an enormous historical responsibility. Well, I'm not a climate change denier. Some of what Thunberg wants, I certainly agree with. But to conclude that Britain, crucible of the Industrial Revolution, should be singled out as if we'd committed an original sin is an act of vaulting ingratitude and contrived amnesia. We had no right, this tiny, tiny island nation, to inaugurate about 300 years ago an era of prosperity that pulled millions out of poverty and produced a quantum leap in the story of human progress on a scale that hadn't been seen since the domestication of animals. It was something bordering on the miraculous that one country should produce per capita so many men, and they were almost all men, who would use science and engineering to find ways of solving seemingly insoluble technical problems. How many children now learn the names of Jethro Tull, Richard Arkwright, or James Watt? How many adults know how much the course of civilization was changed by inventions like the seed drill, the blast furnace, or the steam loom? Chemicals and mining, canals and railways, agriculture and shopping. Our entire human species was enhanced by breakthroughs made in Britain. To even say that now sounds uncomfortably nationalistic, but it's true. The world in which we live, full of human comforts made possible by technology, have their roots in the Industrial Revolution, which took root here. Cities like my birthplace of Bradford sucked in thousands of rural peasants and created wealth with a speed never before seen. It was often ugly, unfair and dangerous. Children worked and died in conditions that would now be seen as utterly barbaric. There was mass enrichment, but also exploitation. Our people, my ancestors, perhaps yours too, toiled and bled and perished for the innovations that the world, including Greta Thunberg, now take for granted. She can't have it both ways. Yes, we may have fired up the steam engines that blackened cities like Bradford with soot, but we also set in train a process of machine-driven evolution that gave us advanced healthcare, transportation and communications. Take away Britain's Industrial Revolution, Greta, and you take away the spark that lit centuries of human advancement. Her belittling of Britain is all of a piece. It's fashionable to blame us for things we were once encouraged to find praiseworthy. We obsess about slavery and colonialism and ignore how we bestowed on the world a global language and way of life that is emulated everywhere. We talk as if none of this would have been possible without immigration or the proceeds of the slave trade, even when they frequently had no bearing on the leaps of imagination which made the Industrial Revolution possible. Of course, it's true that few inventions happen in isolation, that all innovators stand on the shoulders of others. But what was remarkable about the Industrial Revolution we gave to the world was how much it relied on what Britain was. A place of stability, of contracts and commerce, of parliamentary democracy and freedom of conscience. Incredibly boring, but terribly important things like the rule of law and patents. Greta Thunberg ignores all this with her sweeping and puerile indictment of the Industrial Revolution and her casual libel of British achievements. She is the epitome of a culture that actively rewrites history to fit a simplistic story of good and evil. And she has the temerity to say to us, how dare you? How dare she? That's the brazier angle. Well, in just a moment, we'll speak to the eminent historian, Dr. David Starkey, for his reaction to Greta Thunberg's comments. But first, let's hear exactly what she said.
More or less, it started in the UK, since that's where the Industrial Revolution started. We started to burn coal there. So, of course, the UK has an enormous historical responsibility when it comes to historic emissions and so on, since the climate crisis is an accumulative crisis. I find it very strange that they are the ones who we are supposed to look up to now, but they are objectively one of the biggest climate villains.
Dr. David Starkey is with me here in the studio. Thanks ever so much for coming in. Lovely to see you.
You too, Colin.
She's got a point, hasn't she? It started here. We started burning coal furiously before anybody else had even thought about it. We bear a particular responsibility.
We do. We bear a responsibility for the entire modern world. Fundamentally, and that's a quick summary of what you've just said now, modernity is invented in Britain. And you left out half of the story. We don't just invent all the important things we were talking about. We invent modern dress, what you and me are wearing. Look at what people wore before that. We invent all modern games. The modern world, we invent the weekend. Even the French call it le weekend. We invent modernity. Right. So what is Greta really objecting to? She's objecting to the modern world. Greta, well, she's sort of an environmentalist. But look again at the language you used. Dare I ask you to scrutinise it? You began Holy Writ, original sin. Dare I say it, when you tried rather ineffectively to flagellate me last week, you asked about should the world forgive me? This is religious language.
That might be me, David. I'm a bit of a loopy Catholic.
I know. We can only share sympathy. But the problem is that we're having a new religious revival. Greta Thunberg is not really an environmentalist. She's just wearing environmentalist dress. Let me tell you what she is. She's really a religious nutter at Hyde Park Corner. The end of the world is nigh.
What if she's right, David?
The end of the world is nigh. Well, first of all, if it were, there'd be nothing we could do to stop it.
Millions of people dispute that, by the way.
No.
They may be wrong, but they dispute it.
Okay, well then, but let's just get the religious point right first. This is a form of millenarianism. It's completely known about. It appears repeatedly throughout history. And what we've done, we've got rid of God without getting rid of religion. What you have with somebody like Thunberg is she really worships the earth. She's a worshipper of the nature goddess, right? But what we've done, we brought the whole notion of flagellant Christianity. You as a Catholic will know all about this. We mustn't have too much pleasure. It's very bad for you. What do you do if you have too much pleasure? You flagellate yourself. You mustn't have too many possessions because they make you luxurious. Another great Catholic, Savonarola, at the end of the 15th century in Florence, which is again one of the precursors of all this, the world of the Medici, the wonderful multiplication of goods in Florence. What do? Oh, we have sinned, we have sinned. We burn, you have a bonfire of the vanities.
It was that G.K. Chesterton quote, wasn't it? Another good Catholic who said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything.
And what we've done, we are believing in nature worship. Again, look at relatively respectable figures, and I emphasise relatively respectable, like David Attenborough. David Attenborough is really a rather mad late medieval saint, or maybe a very early one. He's a St. Simon Stylites, an ancient seer, whereas Greta Thunberg is the classic medieval child saint.
Was he the one who stood on top of the pillar?
He's the one who stood on top of a pillar. You could just imagine Attenborough there, can't you? So fundamentally, we should be laughing at them. We take them far too... We are, but even here, even in this station, you take climate change and all that with this awful seriousness. If there is a problem, technology will deal with it. We've already seen what happens when you try to anticipate technology. What did the government have to do when we suddenly realised that if you stop producing fertiliser, you stop producing CO2, at which point our entire modern food chain collapses?
Well, I made the point, David, you probably didn't see, but earlier this week I made the point that technology may well ride to our rescue. Apropos, the tankers will have driverless trucks, will have drones.
Everything. I mean, it's we're engaged in a completely irrational response.
I want to talk about the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
We both grew up in the north.
Me on the other side.
On the other side,
yeah.
And maybe it wasn't as Kendal, not as industrial.
No. My family comes from the worst centre of it. My family comes from Oldham. My father was at Platt Brothers. He is an apprentice from 1921 to 1928. Was at that cusp between steam power and electric.
But there was a reverence, even at 53. I remember sort of growing up. There was a reverence because there were still chimneys dotted across the environment as you looked at it. There was an industrial museum you were dragged to, and you were taught about things like...
And there was Lowry, and there was that landscape of factories.
And the concern has to be that there is an opportunity cost to obsessing about other things other than our industrial revolution. There's an embarrassment almost about it. An embarrassment about the fact that all the people who, listed some of their names.
Yes, the great names.
Toll, Richard Arkwright. how does that fit into the picture of a modern Britain? It doesn't, does it? So we forget about it.
But it has to, because modernity depends on this perpetual advancement. You put your finger on it. It's actually about 500 years ago, from the Renaissance and Reformation. You've had this world which is based, as I said last time, on a notion of hard fact, external reality, and the freedom to debate, to analyse, to adapt, to harness it. And that has transformed human existence. If we listen to Thunberg, I'm afraid we've got to abandon modern medicine. Modern medicine depends on that technology that we're talking about. We've got to abandon what we're doing now, modern communication. We've got actually to abandon democracy. You were wrong. 18th century Britain is not a democracy. It's limited government, it's a parliamentary government. But the very notion that the ordinary man first and then woman in the street was capable of voting is a product of industrialization. It's a product of their enormous betterment of living standards. Remember, you didn't dare mention capitalism. Capitalism is what enabled all this. You left that out when you were talking about the Industrial Revolution. We're the country that invents the limited liability company.
Along with the Dutch, a little bit.
Yes, but theirs never really got going. We overtook them within the first decade of the 18th century. But here, you see, we were bigger. And we did something else, which is really important. This is where the British Empire comes in. The British Empire globalizes industrialization. The beginning of globalization, which has led to all the things that I think Ms. Thunberg would quite like the fact that people in India and Africa live longer, the fact that they are increasingly, at least where there's been capitalism, once India and China stopped messing with communism and started to have capitalism, their living standards soar. The beginning of that is Britain. And it's done, above all, again, through things we don't like the Royal Navy and the immense technological advances, partly through the wonderful Royal Naval dockyards, which every school child should be taken to visit. So what we do is we create modernity, we export modernity, and finally, to bring the whole thing back to your point about slavery, why can we get rid of slavery? Why is Britain not only the first country to industrialise, but the first country to get rid of slavery?
Because
machines make it redundant.
What do you say to people who will argue, I overstate my case, as I enumerate that list of achievements from Britain and overstate the fact that this little island produced so much? They will say these were inventions just waiting to be invented. If we hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. I'm being a petty nationalist.
I think this is childish. I mean, the response is childish. The innovations tend to cluster. This is the most striking thing. And they cluster here. Is it generally known that Trinity College, Cambridge, one college, produces more Nobel Prize winners than France? There is... Innovation breeds off innovation. It's also really important we understand, although I've mentioned Cambridge, my own university, even though it's disowned me, the great centre of innovation in Britain are cities. It is the transformation of London, the extraordinary society of London, and then the creation of these great new cities, Birmingham, with the Lunar Society, Derby, and with those wonderful paintings of the great furnaces, Edinburgh, Glasgow, because, of course, it all spreads to Scotland, but only after union. The great enlightenment of Scotland is a pure product of union.
When we look at Greta Thunberg, and we look at the determination almost of people to believe in her, and I see it amongst my
religious
peers.
again, determination to believe.
There's a
yes.
reluctance, it seems, to criticise because she's young, possibly even, I use the word in quotes, slightly odd. I'll say no more than that. But she
just
is
typically saint-like. They were all mad. I mean, what were we saying? Again, we've reversed our attitude to madness. We take madness and disability seriously.
If you actually pass what she's saying, if you transcribe, as we did, what she said
it's
in the
rubbish.
clip there,
it's rubbish.
It's worse than rubbish.
Yeah.
It's deeply, deeply offensive. It's a libel against all those achievements that our ancestors arrived at over the course of hundreds of years and then bestowed upon the world. I mean, there's another point, isn't there, about the nature of slavery in all this and how that interacts. You've made that point already. We've got about a minute or so left. Enlarge, if you can, on this idea that people will ascribe lots of reasons for the success of this country. It's because of immigration. It's because of slavery. And yet we had people like, okay, this predates the Industrial Revolution, Newtonian physics. What did Isaac Newton then, what's the connection there between, the benefits of slavery and the ingenuity of some of Britain's greatest thinkers? Because I don't see it.
Well, there is one, in the sense that there is no doubt that you're really talking about the Caribbean trade. You're talking about the enormous importance of the sugar plantations, and then later on the southern colonies of the United States. Well, the West India trade was extremely important from about the 1680s to the middle of the 18th century. Right.
So you could make a case that provided the seed capital for
there is no doubt whatever that, let's be honest. But it's really important to get it to scale. When the National Trust did its analysis, its deeply loaded analysis of its properties, about 20%, 1/5, have a direct input from the slave trade. And if you actually look and you compare the weight of that input with the weight of what you were talking about, in other words, British native talent, you can see it very clearly in several of their houses. You will get about a 20% coming from the slave trade. And do you know what you do with it? That money then goes into industrialisation, yes. But who builds it up? It's Welsh slave quarriers. It's Welsh coal miners. It's Yorkshire coal miners. It's this enormous explosion of the late 18th, early 19th century. And do you know what? This is why Bristol has been so much in the news with Colston. Do you know why Colston's statue was put up at the end of the 19th century?
You'll tell us.
Because Bristol was failing, because it hadn't industrialised, because it hadn't become the equivalent of Bradford, Manchester, Oldham, Glasgow. That's why they suddenly look back. So it's an episode, it's not the foundation, and it certainly is not what actually developed and accumulated into Britain, the inventor of modernity. It's why we can abolish it.
David, I wasn't distracted because you were losing my interest. I was simply looking at the number of people who voted, more than 10,000 in just under 2 hours, who say by a magnitude of 96% to 3%, 3.4%, in answer to the question. Greta Thunberg says the UK's history means we have a particular responsibility for climate change. 96.6% of those 10,052 votes say, should Britain be proud of the Industrial Revolution? An emphatic yes. An enormous thank you to David Starkey for coming in.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.